Watch for Book Beat, featuring Minneapolis Madams, a book by Penny Petersen, at 5 p.m. Sunday, repeated Monday at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Channel 20. I'm trying something new today. I've got my questions on my phone. Good afternoon and welcome to Book Beat. Reading books is the key to an enlightened society. You want a key light back there, right?
I'm just gonna borrow this.
I think we're about ready, aren't we, Jesse? Good. Book Beat is a show about books and book readers.
A very odd combination of topics.
We interview book club members. How are your books chosen? And film their discussions.
Trying to find happiness and love in her life.
We also provide tips for forming book clubs
I think you just have to find a group of interested book readers.
and books that are current that might be enjoyable to read. In a society where everything is instantaneous, we're losing that sense of depth that reading can bring that other media doesn't. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny. Well, I can't guarantee Oprah, but I can guarantee Channel 20. Look for Book Beat, Sundays at 5 p.m., repeated Monday at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Channel 20. See you then. I'm Sue Ellen, and I'm from Maple Grove.
Hey, did you know as a resident of Maple Grove, you have an all-access pass to Northwest Community Television? You can produce your own show or help other residents create theirs.
I've decided to produce Book Beat because I love books, and I like learning about authors and learning about book clubs, and it's just really fun.
Ready to produce your own show? Visit nwct.org. Get your all-access pass today. This program contains mature content. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Welcome to Book Beat. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny, and I'm your host today. Our guest is Penny Petersen, author of a book called Minneapolis Madams. Welcome, Penny.
Thank you so much, Sue Ellen.
This appears to be a very interesting book. I would like you to tell us something about it.
Well, it started as a bike ride, actually. I was out riding my bike on the riverfront, and I came across this building you see here. And my first thought, the building is located on 11th Avenue South. It's near the Guthrie Theater, Mill City Museum, just to familiarize you with the general area. And my first thought was, wow, that's a really nice townhouse, probably owned by a wealthy family in the 1890s. And then my second thought was, no, that can't be, because rich people were not living on the riverfront in the 1890s. It was a dirty, smelly, noisy place. So my next thought is, oh, well, maybe the building was built in the wrong place, which rarely happens. So my curiosity was aroused. My next move is to go to the building records.
Okay, why did you do that? What about you made you go to the building records of a building that you saw?
To back up a little bit, I'm a researcher for a historical consulting firm, and I've always been very interested in the Minneapolis riverfront. I love buildings. So I thought, well, this needs investigation. There's something strange here. There's something wrong. What I found when I went to the building records, and this is a permit index card you see here on the screen, and it's highlighted. I did the highlighting. It tells me that there are permits issued for a sporting house and for a house of ill fame. Now, if you don't know what that means bordellos. Those were 19th century euphemisms for bordellos. So my next thought is, well, maybe it's not built in the wrong place, but really, why is the city issuing permits for houses of prostitution. It's always been illegal. How could this possibly be? So I had to do more digging. Now, I'm collapsing the storyline here. I didn't do it all in the same day.
No.
It took
No.
13 years
Oh
to
my
begin
goodness.
this book to publication. So I don't want to go through all 13 years of research. We don't have time for that.
Right. Right.
But what I did is I started reading, I started looking for sources for this. Now, a lot of the records disappeared. We used to have this thing called a municipal court. Those records were thrown out long ago. I really didn't have much luck looking for in the obvious places, so I had to start looking in the not so obvious places. And I started reading newspapers from the time, just how did this come about, and looking for this. Fortunately, there were a few arrest records that I could find through Hennepin County, but it really wasn't easy. So I started reading the newspapers, and I finally came across this very interesting article from 1867 that kind of explains some of the attitudes towards, well, prostitution, also known as the social evil. Minneapolis, as you may know, was founded by a lot of Easterners. They came from the New England states, and they had particular attitudes towards what they wanted the city to be. They were founding this city in the beginning. They were hoping for well-educated, very industrious citizens who would go to work every day and work very hard to build this city. What they really did not want is a bunch of people who drank alcohol, who indulged in prostitution, that sort of thing. And they saw themselves as kind of the city on the hill. And this newspaper article, which is very long, points out this city is known abroad as a moral, upright city. Its citizens are noted for their honesty, integrity, and enterprise. And many a person houses of ill repute. About 1867, Minneapolis is actually becoming a city at that point. It's moving from a village, and they're putting together city ordinances. And they said what they would not do, unlike St. Paul, we are rivals of St. Paul, we still are, but in those days the rivalry was particularly strong. We would not institute this system of monthly fines. And the monthly fine system is every month madams would come in, plead guilty to running houses of prostitution and running prostitution, pay a fine, and then, as one newspaper said, were told to go and sin some more so they could do it again next month. And they said, well, you'd expect that from St. Paul, really, but we're not going to do that here. However, by 1868, the following year, they had instituted a system of fines.
Oh, really?
Yes, yes. And so the madams and ordinary prostitutes would plead guilty to prostitution, pay their fines into the city treasury. They weren't paying off the mayor or paying off the judge. This was going into the city treasury. So it's hardly municipal corruption. You may say this isn't a very good way of controlling prostitution, but in a way it was. To give it more context, at the time, women, first of all, there was a real double standard for women and men in terms of sexual behavior.
What's new?
Yeah, well, it was even worse in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Men had almost unlimited sexual freedom. Women, not so much, not at all. So if a man had sexual relations outside of marriage, well, boys will be boys. A woman was ruined. If you combine that with the low social economic status of women, women certainly worked outside the home in those days, but they were not paid the same as men. Now, you can point out that hasn't changed that much, but it's gotten a little better.
Right.
They would earn approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of what men did.
Right.
And yet they paid full market price for food, rent, clothing, medical care.
So they were in poverty
They
from
were,
the get-go.
yes. So you have this double standard of behavior, very low paid female workforce for the most part. Guess what you have? You have a class of professional women who will service those men. So this is kind of baked in to the city. And this is not unique to Minneapolis in any way. That was typical of the times. So for instance, what you see here is a picture of the North Star Woolen Mill. And this was actually, you know, a factory that, well, it's now a high-priced condo, actually.
Oh, really?
It's on the riverfront. It doesn't look like this now. But they were very poor working conditions. They were very poorly paid. Women there were paid about 90 cents a day for a 10-hour to 12-hour day. They were, and this is, you know, fairly typical at the time. So they would be working 6.5 days a week usually. Mm-hmm. You'd be getting, you know, $5 or $6 a week. Well, a decent boarding house was $5 a week.
So you had
so
nothing.
You'd have a place to live and some food to eat, but say you wanted clothes to wear, or you got sick, or you needed money for transportation. Well, what do you think? Mm-hmm. So what these madams were offering some women, they certainly didn't all turn to prostitution, was a decent livelihood, which is kind of puts it in a different context. I might read a little bit about one of the madams I discovered.
Would you please?
This opens chapter 2. What I'm talking about here is a woman called Nettie Conley. That was not her real name. They all worked under pseudonyms, which also made it difficult to research them. But I did figure out in many cases who they were. Mm-hmm. She was actually born in upstate New York. Uh-huh. She found her way to Minneapolis certainly by the early 1870s, possibly before. She began running a house of ill repute on Main Street. And this is in the early days. This chapter opens with 2 men fighting over her favors in the wee hours of the morning. The brawl between Gillette and Knox may have been the first mention of Nettie Conley in the local press, but it would hardly be the last. Men like Gillette and Knox would frequently abandon their reason as well as their cash while in her company. Over her long career as a public woman, Conley openly operated brothels, and neither purity crusades, fines, nor prison sentence kept her down for long. Accounts of men fighting over her favors only added to her reputation, as well as providing her with free advertising. The raven-haired, gray-eyed Conley would be featured in local newspapers for 3 decades. Yet today, no one knows who she is. Oh. So I discovered a whole group of women, and whether you love them or hate them, they had a lot of effect on Minneapolis policy and history.
So tell me about some other of the women. I remember one woman, Ida Dorsey.
Well, Ida Dorsey was actually the madam who built the bordello that I ran across on my bike ride. She was born in Kentucky, either slightly before the end of the Civil War or right after. It's hard to say. She has a number of birth dates. I haven't been able to determine which one is true, but she was either born into slavery or shortly thereafter. Her mother had been enslaved. Her father apparently was white. She lived in Kentucky until she was in her late teens, as far as I can see. Her mother, the relationship with the first man ended, and she eventually married a formerly enslaved black man. And they had a place in Lexington, Kentucky. They were fairly successful for their time. He had a small land that he farmed. She apparently kept house. They had Ida Dorsey and her sister Roberta had a number of half-siblings. They were brothers. At some point, Ida Dorsey, again, not her birth name, found her way to St. Paul and then eventually to Minneapolis. And as soon as she hit town, she was a subject of newspaper reports. Apparently, she was quite beautiful. And she was running a bordello, and she would only allow white men in it, rich white men. And she attracted that class of customer from the day she hit town until her death in the 1918, I believe. So she was selling interracial sex, which if you thought prostitution was, sex outside of marriage was bad, she was selling interracial sex. She was playing on sexual stereotypes and making a mint while doing it. Mm. And she built that place in 1890. She was not even 30 years old. So clearly she had access to a lot of capital, and she was earning a lot of money.
How did these women buy this land, and how did they hold
Buy.
property in a time when women were chattel?
Well, first of all, they didn't marry.
Okay.
If you married, your earnings would be subject to your husband's control. A lot of them had boyfriends, but they were usually pretty careful not to marry because you'd give up your autonomy. They collected, almost all of them, as far as I can tell, started as what might be called ordinary prostitutes. I think they had a lot of administrative skills. I think they had, great financial skills. Certainly college, graduate schools, professional schools were not open to these women at the time. It wasn't like, should I run a bordello or should I go to law school? That was not the choice they were facing. And especially in Ida Dorsey's case, she was African American, and she would really be kept out of these places. Yet they were very, very smart. I think they accumulated a lot of money. They would also, because they had contacts, shall we say, with the elite of Minneapolis, they would buy the land very often from very wealthy men who owned it. Sometimes they would do it secretly, sometimes not so secretly. They had the cash to do this, and I think some of them at least had a line of credit.
That's amazing.
Which, yes, it is very amazing.
Amazing.
So they, again, whether you love them or hate them, they had a lot of effect on the city. Their activities did not go unnoticed by reformers, though, and I think one of the most interesting things I found was about the late 1870s, there's a move to basically make war on the madams. The reformers say if we would just enforce the laws, just zero tolerance, perhaps you've heard of that, it'll go away.
So well.
It's worked so well here, yes, I know, in modern times. So after a while, they have a purity crusade, and one of the people behind it, who lends his name to it, is one John S. Pillsbury. Perhaps you've heard of the Pillsbury Flour Company. He was one of the founders of that. At the time, he was also Governor Pillsbury. He was a 3-term governor. And so he lent his name to this purity crusade. And in the fullness of time, they indicted 4 of the leading madams, among them Nitty Conley. Ida Dorsey is not on the scene at this point. She hasn't arrived in Minneapolis. And they they indict 4 of them, and they try 3 of them. One of them is too sick to be tried. She's not too sick to run her business that month, but she gets her lawyer to put this off, which is really quite brilliant. So the 3 of them are indicted, they're tried, they're found guilty, they're sent off to Stillwater Prison. And the local police chief said, well, this is great, but there's still some bordellos operating. I think we should close them all. It's not fair that these other women are in prison. So he does just that. The result is not really the end of prostitution, as it turns out. Instead of operating within bordellos behind closed doors, the prostitution spreads all over the city. So instead of being contained, it's all over. And there's this huge citizen outrage. What was maybe not so pleasant before was just intolerable. It really became very public. So the mayor, that was Alonzo Rand, who to his credit had said, this purity crusade idea is a really bad idea. Don't do this. Well, they didn't listen to him. So he did what he had to do, which was namely get all the leading men of the city to petition the governor. They signed a petition to the governor, that would be John S. Pillsbury, to let the madams out of prison and send them back to the city to get this under control.
So there were red light districts at the time?
Yes, and so that bordello, the first one I saw, was just it represented one of 3 red light districts. There was one on Main Street, right where St. Anthony on Main is more or less today, that area. There was one on First Street where the Central Post Office is located. It was the whole area. And then there was one on 11th Avenue South. Now, 11th Avenue South was the last one to be formed, and that was the last one kind of left. There were There were 1.5 buildings, so to speak, that were former bordellos when I started the book. Now there's just Ida Dorsey's, because a condominium was being built around it, as it turned out.
What has happened with that building?
Well, in 1910, the city closed down the red light districts officially. That didn't stop prostitution. And that building had a number of incarnations, or it is now a very respectable apartment building. It's not a bordello at all, but it's the last one standing. But the other buildings were used for various things and eventually were torn down. But one of the effects of the War on the Madams, which was so very unsuccessful, and I have a picture of Nenny Conley's pardon, and it goes into the details of how many respectable men signed this sort of thing. So they wanted the red light districts, and they didn't want the red light districts. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. One of the things that was a result of it was the imposition of the liquor patrol limits. The city decided, if we can't eliminate prostitution and other vices, we'll have red light districts, and we'll also have liquor patrol districts. And this is where all the liquor could be consumed and sold. And this really had a big effect on the riverfront. Our liquor patrol districts lasted until 1974.
Oh my goodness.
And this really determined what the riverfront looked like. Strangely enough, there were a lot of saloons, sometimes door-to-door saloons, which thought, well, that's terrible. Well, if that's the only place they can be, that's where they'll be. So today, you still, some of the bars you see along the riverfront really go back to the old liquor patrol limits.
Oh my
And that's why
goodness.
it's hard, as one friend of mine said, to get a mixed drink south of Lake Street. It's hard to get a cocktail. And they're slowly changing. But they had a huge effect on the city. It was the Madams that formed the 11th Avenue district. About 1890, shortly before Ida built her building, it was very clear the Madams had come to an agreement with the city, a secret agreement. I've never found the actual document. I don't think it exists. That the new red light district would be around 11th Avenue, because First Street was kind of going downhill. Some of them moved over to Main Street and expanded that district. Jenny Jones, who had come here from Chicago in the 1880s, was on First Street for a while. You see her name in the city directories. I have a picture of that you'll see. She was very, very successful, and she actually extended the red light district on Main Street into Main Street Northeast.
Oh, really?
And built this wonderful, unfortunately torn down bordello. She hired Harry Carter. He was a well-known theater architect, and she was kind of offering theater in a way. And that was there for many years. Nettie Conley, when she got out of prison, maybe she met some really successful madams there who said, Nettie, you could do a lot better, because she was running this kind of low-down place on Main Street. And within a couple of years of getting out of prison, she had built a new bordello on Main Street, a 3-story brick and stone place.
Oh my goodness.
She had also had one on First Street that was decorated by no less than John S. Bradstreet.
Oh.
He was a leading Midwestern tastemaker. He decorated the Congdon Mansion in Duluth, Dunwoody Mansion here. He was very, very well known. And she was moving up in the world. Instead of servicing lumberjacks, she was servicing lumbermen.
Yes.
So her clientele changed. She had gone from, kind of cheap bordellos to very expensive ones. And she was in the business for 30 years, and she retired around the turn of the century. But she didn't stop working. She had become a banker and kind of real estate agent to other madams. So she had, again, a very successful career. She had only married once, and she got rid of that guy pretty quick. But she had a series of boyfriends. The last one was 20 years her junior. So she was, maybe
Not
a
all
cougar
bad.
or something like that.
Yeah, not all bad.
She outlived him, and she died very old and rich.
With red light districts, were there any controls on the health of the women that worked in them? Did the health department?
Well, that was kind of, there's kind of a belief, well, Doc Ames, who was probably our most corrupt mayor, pretended to have exams of these women, but he was basically, the doctors, would charge the inmates of these bordellos a monthly fee to examine them for venereal disease, but these certificates were worth, it was just, now that was really just corrupt. I think the working girls, to some extent, were able to protect themselves with condoms. They came in the 1850s, and they were certainly not perfect, but they were somewhat helpful, I believe. But syphilis and that sort of thing was fairly common at the time. If you look at death records from the late 19th century, early 20th century, that's often a contributing cause. So these were not great jobs or anything like that, but you might survive in it. They would have also had to examine their customers, even if they had tests that would show, I think mostly it's blood tests, but which they weren't going to do. So clearly it was ineffective at best. So I think there were some ways, but I don't think they were in any way 100% or anything like that.
So it wasn't an organized, like you said, the liquor patrols, like the health. There wouldn't have been something with the health
No,
services.
because I think for one thing, the state of medicine, I mean, germ theory at that point was still pretty radical idea. And they didn't know how you transmitted these and there were no real cures like we have now.
Right.
So yeah, this was one of the hazards of the job, and for that matter, hazards of their patrons. It went both ways.
Right.
As I said, condoms would help. I don't know if they were completely effective, but they would help. It would be a start. But there was really no way to manage this. And even the liquor patrol limits, it didn't stop people from drinking.
Right, right.
It made them drink in a certain area.
Right. And that limited the prostitution to a certain area, too.
Right. And again, not everyone complied with this. There would be some secret places where some madam was not paying her fees. But the other madams would tend to enforce it. If I have to pay the fee, you're going to pay the fee. It's like, if I have to have a liquor license, I want everyone else to have a liquor license. More or less even playing field. But that didn't mean people didn't break the law.
Oh, yes.
So
tell me a little bit more about the petition of bringing back
the madams? Well,
yes.
This was one of my favorite things in the research. The petitions or copies of the petitions still exist today. You can get a copy at the Historical Society if you're interested.
Oh,
you can
really?
read all the names on there. And the reasons they cite, they said these women have been paying their monthly fees for so many years, and they listed the amounts they had been paying over so many years. So they were complying with the law, you might say. Getting around the law, but also complying with it. Why are we subjecting them to double jeopardy? They paid their fines. Why are they in prison now? And of course, the unspoken reasoning here was also, why aren't they here keeping prostitution under control? They're in prison. There's all this activity going on that we do not like to see in our public streets going on. Why aren't they here controlling prostitution? Because they were actually agents of control. They weren't going to eliminate prostitution, but they were going to keep it behind closed doors. So the advantage of a red light district is if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can reliably find it there. If you're not interested, you can avoid it.
Stay away.
As opposed to, I was just walking down the street with my child, and imagine my you don't want to see that thing in public.
No. No.
Whatever you think of, you don't want to see it in public. And this also makes it more dangerous. The madams would look after their charges to the extent that they wanted their employees there working every day. I don't know that they, treated them like their children or something. I mean, they were not that solicitous of them, but they certainly wanted them on the job every day.
Right, right.
Like most bosses want you to come to work every day.
And what about drugs?
There were drugs there, yeah.
That was a
Well,
problem too.
well, yeah. I mean, opium, even heroin, all these things were pretty available at the time to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Really, until the Harrison Act of 1914, you could buy them at the pharmacy. This is like buying a bottle of aspirin today.
The patent medicines.
The patent medicines with alcohol or opium, they were pretty available. And certainly there was drug use by the prostitutes and their customers as well. This is, again, we think of this as pretty awful. And drugs are not great, but they were pretty available. There was a whole group of Civil War veterans who came back, horribly injured, and they would take these things just to relieve the pain. So it was certainly widely available. So yes, there were certainly sex and drugs in the red light districts and other places.
There's no rock and roll yet.
Not rock and roll yet. That was in the future.
Yes. See if you can tell me some more that I'm missing.
Well, let's see. We can talk about some of the pictures we have here. Well, there's the map of the riverfront. That tells you where the three red light districts are. So you could actually, if you want to take a walk, you could walk around the riverfront. There's certainly a map here, an 1891 map, which I had a great deal of fun with. It's a bird's eye view of Minneapolis. It's beautifully colored. And for reasons I don't quite understand, in the center of the map is the First Street District. Now, these little white arrows you see, I've added.
Okay.
But that tells you there was a whole district. It wasn't just a couple. There was these women created neighborhoods, you might say. And for a time, the First Street District was the place to be. That's where Nettie Connolly, when she moved from Main Street, well, she kept her place on Main Street, but she had a branch office, I guess you might say, on First Street. So just a walk across the Hennepin Avenue Bridge. And it was, high-priced real estate. There was another woman called Sarah Carnahan who had 3 places there.
Oh my goodness.
And the interesting thing about Sarah Carnahan is it was like she had 3 different levels. You could go to Kmart, you could go to Macy's, or you could go to Bergdorf Goodman. And so,
wow.
But either way, you were paying Sarah Carnahan. She was enormously successful.
Yeah. And it was probably top dollar for the level that
yes,
that was
and there were newspaper reporters would often report on this. This is great free advertising because they couldn't exactly take out a newspaper ad. They certainly appeared in the city directories, and you knew who Miss Jenny Jones was. But newspaper reporters would be present at these bordellos, and they would describe, this place is very expensive, whereas this place is lower priced. This place, some of them were just in and out as quickly as possible, and some, they were, gentlemen's clubs. They would, you'd spend the whole night there and spend a lot of money. And so they were looking to high-end clients. Another story I ran across was when young Quinlan, Elizabeth Quinlan, who was a very successful businesswoman, opened her store. I think it was in 1895, the Young Quinlan building. She was really catering to wives of flour millers and lumbermen, very high-end stuff. And 2 groups of women show up at the opening. There's the wives of the very rich men, and she's delighted to see them. But she said then there was another group, these big, bold, beautiful women from Main Street with their pockets just bulging with cash.
Oh my goodness.
And she just thought, I'm ruined. And fortunately, her partner, Fred Young, said, Elizabeth, you sell to the carriage trade. I'll sell to the Main Street, and never the twain shall meet. But so these women were part of the landscape. And they were really competing for the same rich white man. Jenny Jones workers were competing for rich men, as were the wives. I mean, they were in competition.
Was there what is commonly known as street prostitutes?
Oh, yes, yes. Now, the reason I didn't talk about that as much is they're very hard to follow. It was hard enough to follow these madams who built big buildings and were in the newspaper a lot. Many of them left wills. They left their, usually they'd leave their money to their families, and they would write out, you know, who gets what. Street prostitution certainly existed then as it does now, but they were hard to follow. Again, they're all working under assumed names. Census workers do not necessarily identify them. I mean, you might have a day job, so to speak, and just practice prostitution on the side just to make ends meet. They got more, certainly got more police harassment. It was certainly more dangerous. It's dangerous then as it is now.
Yes.
And so you wouldn't necessarily know who they were. And they would also move from city to city. And even the women that were working in these bordellos tended to move around a lot. They wouldn't stay there for years and years and years. You'd age out of the profession.
Right.
The goal usually was to do this for not very long, move someplace else, assume a different name.
Make a new life.
Yeah, and never talk about it. And this is another reason these stories get lost. You know, it's one thing to say, well, Grandma, what did you do before you married Grandpa? Oh, I sold ladies' shoes at Dayton's. That's a nice story. These might not be so nice stories, so you would simply never talk about it. So these are not things that get passed down, which is another reason these women are so difficult to study. You really have to dig out stuff, and sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not.
Tell me about the city directories.
Well, they're kind of like the old style phone books, which I guess are going out of fashion now too. City directories would usually, you know, they'd go door to door and they would ask how many people are living here, and, you know, this is John Doe and his wife Mary Doe. And if you were of working age, they would list children, you know, if they were living with their parents but working as an apprentice somewhere, say. And they would also go into the bordellos, you know, who's the madam in charge here? Oh, Ida Dorsey. And you'd see these women appear, their names year after year in the city directories if you knew where to look. Typically they're inmates. The women who were living there didn't have their names listed because, again, they would change fairly often. But you can trace Nettie Conley from the early 1870s, well, gosh, at least till the turn of the century. She assumed not her maiden name. She assumed the name of the man she was living with, but they were never married later on. But and her will is actually written under her professional name of Nettie Conley. She became Nettie Conley. She turned herself into that. So the city directories, which you can certainly find at, well, certainly the Minneapolis Public Library and the Historical Society, they were issued every year, and you can trace all sorts of people through there. People use this for genealogy or, well, any number of things. But so if you needed to know where Jenny Jones was, I've heard Jenny Jones, I want to visit her place. Now, is she on First Street? No, she's moved to Main Street now. So you look, oh, 27 Main Street Northeast. Yes, okay. Go knock on her door.
Now, was that actually how it happened, that people would knock on the door?
Yeah.
Or would they have to be referred?
No, they would knock on the door. And I think they would either let you in or they wouldn't. As I said, Ida Dorsey, who was herself African American, would not allow African American men as customers into her bordello. And you would know, you know, they would check you out like, do you look prosperous? Do you look like you can afford this sort of place? Yes, well, come in, sir. What can I do for you?
If you can flash the cash.
Yeah, I think they would size them up pretty quickly because I think they were pretty smart. So yeah, no, you just knock on the door. I would not be knocking on the door, but
nor would I.
but no, and it really wasn't any different than going to a restaurant, you know.
Is there anything that I have not asked that you'd like to share with us?
Well, let's see. Well, I think one of the motivations behind writing this book, because it really didn't start out as a book. I just thought it was going to be a bunch of fun stories I could share with my historian friends when you go out to dinner. You know, look what I've discovered. And one of them finally said, this is a book. You have to write this book. I would be hoping for a greater appreciation of the diversity of the riverfront and these layers and layers of history. And, you know, some acknowledgement of these women. Again, whether you like them or don't like them, they had a tremendous effect on the city. And they're just, it's a lost class of women. And I think they're interesting that way, because it's more than just lumber mills and flour mills that had a lot to do with the city. But there's all these other little stories there. And I'm really glad that the last standing or purpose-built bordello is still standing. It doesn't need to be a bordello anymore. I'm glad it's not that. But it's an interesting building. And it's, you know, it's actually a little bit of African American history right in the city. That kind of had an afterlife. Eventually it was taken over by a man called Bert Thompson, and he ran a boarding house for Pullman porters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and because then, and well, I suppose to some extent now, the city was very, very segregated. If you were a Pullman porter and they got in at all hours, where would you stay? You're not going to be allowed at a white hotel. Well, knock on Bert Thompson's door, and you'd be welcome there. He eventually opened a cafe and eventually a nightclub. I'd like to believe that some of the jazz musicians who came through town played there. I don't have any direct evidence of this. I'm still working on that part, but and that's part of that bordello's history too. He was not running it as a bordello, but a bordering house. So,
I'm just. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
We'll take a few minutes, and I'll end the show in just a second, and then we're going to do the promos, and
Okay.
I'm going to do the disclaimer, because I'm going to have a disclaimer at the beginning in case delicate ears need to be. So
There could be delicate ears in this very room.
well, if there are delicate ears in this very room, we'll deal with it. Okay, how do I want to do this? Watch for book. Penny, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to make sure that we've covered as much as we can. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I guess I would urge people to go to the riverfront and take a walk.
Okay.
There, you can see this place. You can see a lot of places. Maybe you'll write a book as a result of this. You'll see a building you don't understand.
Do you have another book in you?
Well, I don't know. I don't write books for the sake of writing books, because I do have a full-time job already. I try to write things that I find, they're basically problems I'm working on that I find interesting. So I write books for the very selfish reason that I want to know something. And sometimes, occasionally, some people, other people find this interesting too. I guess in this case it kind of worked out that way.
Well, it's certainly captivated me. I was interested initially with the pictures of the women and pictures of the maps, because I knew exactly where
Oh, good for you.
where they were situated, and it's kind of a part of the hidden history of the city, and I was very taken with the book, and I hope that your research will bring us more books in the future.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you.
And thank you for being our guest today. Thank you for joining us at BookBeat. Our guest next time will be Greg Bancroft, author of Betsy's Day at the Game. We'll see you then. Thank you for joining us at Book Beat. Our guest next time will be Greg Bancroft, author of Betsy's Day at the Game. We'll see you then.
I'm trying something new today. I've got my questions on my phone. Good afternoon and welcome to Book Beat. Reading books is the key to an enlightened society. You want a key light back there, right?
Just gonna borrow this.
I think we're about ready, aren't we, Jessie? Good. Book Beat is a show about books and book readers.
A very odd combination of topics.
We interview book club members. How are your books chosen? And film their discussions.
Trying to find happiness and love in her life.
We also provide tips for forming book clubs
I think you just have to find a group of interested book readers.
and books that are current that might be enjoyable to read. In a society where everything is instantaneous, we're losing that sense of depth that reading can bring that other media doesn't. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny.
Well, I can't guarantee Oprah, but I can guarantee Channel 20.
Look for Book Beat, Sundays at 5 p.m., repeated Monday at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Channel 20. See you then.
I'm Sue Ellen, and I'm from Maple Grove.
Hey, did you know as a resident of Maple Grove, you have an all-access pass to Northwest Community Television? You can produce your own show or help other residents create theirs.
I've decided to produce Book Beat because I love books and I like learning about authors and learning about book clubs, and it's just really fun.
Ready to produce your own show? Visit nwct.org. Get your all-access pass today.